going to do a little bit of history first, and I only want you to remember two dates. One is 1656. As some of you will know, it's when the Jews came to England, thanks to Manasseh ben Israel persuading Cromwell to let us in. And the first Jews were Sephardi. Later on, the Ashkenazi joined us. And as you probably know, it was the first synagogue was Bevis Mark. One of the characteristics of Bevis Mark is the hierarchy, the leadership had enormous control over what happened and who did what. And one of their regulations, called the Askamot, was that there should be no other synagogue within 6 miles of Bevis Marks. Trouble was, Jews started moving and moved to Bayswater, Maida Vale area. Now, they were still Orthodox, and therefore they walked. But as you well know, Londoners, it's a bit of a schlep from Bayswater to the City of London. And therefore, they wanted to open a branch of Bevis Marks so that they could govern locally according to the Sephardi minhag. However, the Bevis Mark leadership opposed this. They were, I think, afraid of the loss of control, also loss of revenue if they had a branch synagogue that did its own thing. And the result was the second important date, 1840. And in 1840, the rather disgruntled Sephardi members living in Bayswater, Maida Vale, broke away, went independent, and formed their own synagogue. And that also allowed them to introduce a few reforms. Now, that means, by the way, that British reform was born of a Bruigus. Could you believe it? It wasn't really a matter of ideology. Unlike German reform, which was a sort of a definite reaction to the changes in society, where the ghetto walls had come down, you'd got emancipation, the French Revolution, people were either Jews were converting to Christianity or assimilating, and therefore they brought Reform Judaism to counter this new world. So really, to be a little bit cruel, or maybe accurate, take your pick, Reform lacked a theology. And it was very much an ad hoc movement, sort of reacting to circumstances. Some people might say that was characteristic today as well. I couldn't possibly comment. The initial changes that they made, because having got their own branch, they thought they wanted to do a few changes, were very modest. For instance, they omitted the Aramaic prayers. They omitted some of the piyutim, the poems. The only real controversy was of D.W. Marks, the first Reform rabbi, who also omitted the second days of festival. So only one day Rosh Hashanah, 7 days Pesach, and so forth. But they still had prayers for sacrifices. They still talked about the resurrection of the dead. The prayer book still was about the personal Messiah. All those stuff were still around for another 40 years. And by the way, men and women still sat separately. Not until 1933. So it shows that the initial reform was really very hesitant. And by the way, the name, as some of you will know very well, was the West London Synagogue of British Jews. Nothing to do with reform. The trouble was that what happened to the reform movement was, like a lot of new movements, it became institutionalized. It didn't have any missionary zeal. There was another couple of reform synagogues, but the one in Manchester in 1856 was totally independent and formed because of local factors. The one in Bradford, 1873, was really because of German Jews coming over to Bradford and doing their own thing. And really, unfortunately, West London and Reform Judaism stagnated in the same way that Orthodoxy had done. By 1903, there were only 3 synagogues. It's not surprising, therefore, that some people wanted more. And that was as we're going to hear more from Andrew, the Jewish Religious Union in 1902, which sought to revitalize Jewish life. Now, the interesting thing was, it was not a separate body. It was within the West London membership. In fact, one of their leaders, Claude Montefiore, was a warden at West London Synagogue. West London Synagogue, unfortunately, were a bit iffy about this new movement, and they set 10 conditions, including all the preachers and the readers had to be Jewish, all the hymns and psalms had to be composed by members of the Jewish faith. In other words, we can see that they were worried about non-Jewish influence, because there was a lot of intermarriage and also a lot of missionary activity. Oh, by the way, they also insisted that if there was to be a service, the Jewish Religious Union had to keep the sexes separate. Well, that really led to the Jewish Religious Union doing its own thing, hence Liberal Judaism. Let's fast forward now, because we've got 2 movements, and guess what? They talked about merging. Do you know when? 1936. So merger talks have been going on unsuccessfully until now, since 1936. And the very lovely JCP-CAJ was formed. That's, by the way, is the Joint Committee of Progressive Congregations for the Advancement of Judaism. You don't have to remember that. The problem was twofold. Firstly, the leading Reform rabbi, a chap called Harold Reinhardt, objected to what he called adjectival Judaism. He just wanted us to be Jews, not Reform or Liberal, just Jews. Also, there's a lot of rivalry, personal rivalry, between him and the leading Liberal rabbi, Mattock. And I'm being a bit personal here because, frankly, personalities do affect the whole story. Let me quote from Claude Montefiore, who said, when the talks broke down, inevitably, "It seems most regrettable and even absurd that we should not be able, because of trivial differences, and I fear, I must add, trivial minor suspicions and jealousies, to come together and to work for our common cause." Well, what happened was Reform began to grow, really, and I hate to say this, thanks to Hitler, or no thanks to Hitler, and a lot of German Jewish rabbis, about 30 of them, coming here and changing the face of Reform, which then began to grow. It became the ASGB, then the RSGB. Leerbeck College was formed in 56. Didn't involve the liberals. Oh no, don't want to be with that lot. But eventually they merged together, liberals and Reform, in 1964. So in other words, 8 years after the college was formed. And that was largely for financial reasons, interestingly enough, because they just felt that they would be unable to sustain themselves without the liberal involvement. By 1980, those 3 Reform synagogues was 29 in size. And by the way, the Orthodox started attacking us. They hadn't really bothered before because we were so insignificant, why talk about us? But by the 1980s, we were now a significant force and therefore couldn't be ignored. And then we moved to the Manor House. And that was a massive step. Let me quote the then chair of the Liberals, Clive Winston, who said, "Your," referring to Reform, "determination and decisiveness have left us behind you." And quite breathless. "We are alive to the importance of the Manor House and to the opportunity it affords to us both. We must be there. We must be involved with you." And that led to the second set of merger talks in the 1982. And to quote from Hugo Gryn, who said, "At a time when polarization is on the increase and British Jewry is diminishing in size, it's all the more important to swim against the tide and demonstrate a commitment to greater unity." Hugo Gryn, Reform Rabbi of West London Synagogue. Unfortunately, there were 4 major issues. Some of you may remember them. Reform wanted to have a get. After divorce, Liberals didn't. Reform kept to the matrilineal line, Liberals didn't. Reform had a mikveh for converts, Liberals didn't. And also the youth movements were very separate in that the YSGB was now the Reform Synagogue Youth and was Zionist, whereas Upsnik was definitely not. And the problem was, firstly, those differences, and would you believe it, Liberals feared a takeover. Meanwhile, the Reform feared being tarnished by the left-wing elements. And also, once again, personalities came to the top, and the 2 leaders, Raymond Goldman and Sidney Bristow, did not get on. Let me quote from Raymond Goldman. "Any proposal which may eventually emerge will only be worth pursuing if it is capable of being incorporated without completely disturbing the equilibrium between the more radical and the more conservative elements within the movement." What happened? The talks collapsed. A leading rabbi at the time said, "With hindsight, it is clear that compromise was possible. What was lacking was the will to implement it." Now, since then, a lot's changed. You had the rise of Masorti. You had changes in Reform. Reform has become much more radical. It now does mixed faith marriages. It now does gay marriages. The prayer book's got inclusive language. There's transliteration in it. And also, there has been a greater interchange between the rabbis, Liberal and Reform rabbis exchanging pulpits. Obvious people, Julian Neuberger was at South London for many years, Liberal, then went to West London Reform. The reverse was Alex Wright, was at Radlett Reform, then of course went to the LJS, and there are some rabbis, for instance, like Sybil Sheridan, who served 2 liberals and 3 Reform synagogues in her ministry. So now the major issues are, well, they've largely dissipated. Reform has more or less got to equilineal status. In other words, as long as you've got one Jewish parent, liberals often accept the mikveh for conversion. Both youth movements are Zionist in the sense of supporting the people of Israel and the land of Israel. The rabbis, by and large, are very much on board in principle. And of course, our core principles of the two movements are exactly the same. It's a mixture of tradition and change, of being religious and realistic. And when we make our decisions, it's always a mixture of tradition, current situation, personal integrity, and communal cohesion. So let me end by saying that I think there's been a major shift in the way people talk about merger. In the past, the conversation always ended with, why is it that Britain is the only country which has got 2 progressive movements? So it was like a question, no, but never an answer. Whereas now the conversation is, why has it taken us so long to take merger seriously? So that's what I'm going to leave the Reform position, and Rabbi Goldstein will take over.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan. It's interesting. You didn't give many facts. You talk more about the merger, maybe because there aren't too many facts. I don't know. But one fact I'd like to correct you, and I do it with great diffidence because you're the greater historian than me. I think you said that Liberec College admitted liberals in 1966, was it?
64.
64. I didn't hear that yet because I went there in 65. So I've just got in there at the beginning. And so from my point of view, just a little bit about the history of liberal Judaism. Jonathan talked about the beginnings at West London Synagogue, and also said that by the end of the 19th century, things needed somewhat of a boost. And another group of, again, upper-class lay people realized there was a need for another attempt to renew Judaism, as again, synagogue attendance was dropping amongst both the working and the middle classes. And in the upper classes, as you said about Germany, many were marrying non-Jews, and the interest in biblical criticism and scientific discoveries were challenging belief and the pace of assimilation increased. I mean, again, very much like we are at the moment with all of these challenges, both intellectual and societal. And so in those days, a group of what became known as the cousinhood met in drawing rooms. It was very much an upper class thing to discuss these challenges. And 2 names stand out. Claude Montefiore, as you say, was the great nephew of the famous Sir Moses Montefiore, and he was related to many of the cousinhood, the aristocracy of Anglo Jewry. They're all very wealthy, and Montefiore, as you said, was prominent in the West London Synagogue. He was also a great scholar of Judaism and classics, having studied at the Hochschule in Berlin, where his teacher was Solomon Schechter. And he wrote the first in-depth Jewish study of Christianity and also on the Hebrew Bible. And he wrote the rabbinic anthology together with an Orthodox scholar, Herbert Lowe. And the second was Lily Montagu, who's the daughter of Lord Samuel, who was the leader of the Orthodox Federation of Synagogues movement. And she was a voluntary social worker, magistrate, founder of youth centers for poor Jews, especially women. She'd already done services, children's services, on a Saturday afternoon in the West End synagogue, St. Petersburg Place. She went on to lead services and preach as was a woman, I suppose, a reverend, if not a rabbi, long before the role became normative. And Montefiore encouraged her to write an article in the Jewish Quarterly Review in 1899, and she headed it "The Spiritual Possibilities of Judaism today. So it was spirituality, not practice. It was belief, not economics or social positions. Perhaps we should read it again as we ponder the nature of the new movement we are founding at the moment, the movement for Progressive Judaism. Maybe it should have spirituality or maybe Judaism in it. The article led to further discussions that led to the first public meeting in 1902 of the Jewish Religious Union. Again, it had the word religious in it. The idea was not to compete with other synagogues, whether they be Orthodox or West London Synagogue, but to offer a non-challenging additional experience. And so services were held on a Saturday afternoon in a hotel ballroom. The Reverend Simeon Singer, who of course was the one who's produced the old United Synagogue book, Singer's Prayer Book, Reverend Singer read the service. Claude Montefiore preached. There was mixed seating, and again, going back to what Jonathan said, it was a challenge to West London Synagogue. A mixed seating, there was a mixed choir and an organ, and 400 people attended, it was widely reported. After a couple of meetings, the Jewish Religious Union, West London Synagogue, as Jonathan said, that they made a number of stipulations about separate sexes and no hymns by a non-Jew and so on. And this was unacceptable to the group founding the Jewish Religious Union, and they continued to meet, therefore, in the Marylebone Hotel. There was little liturgy. In fact, the first prayer book was this thin, and a substantial intellectual sermon, and that was the focus. Initially, the leaders included Orthodox ministers as well as Reform lay people. Though once the JRU became popular, the Orthodox leaders were forced out by the chief rabbi. After a decade, it was decided there was a need for a synagogue. And the first name suggested, interestingly enough, was the London Reform Synagogue. But instead, the Liberal Jewish Synagogue was founded in 1910. Opening in a small chapel in Marylebone, it grew rapidly, and by 1925, the Liberal Jewish Synagogue was opened in St. John's Wood. And now there was a need for a rabbi, because none of the United Synagogue rabbis would continue with the movement or were forced out. Montefiore went to America and brought back the third M, Israel Matak. He was born in Lithuania, a strictly Orthodox family. He was Yiddish speaking, but at Hebrew Union College, the Reform College in America, he became very radical. He was fortunate that he married a wealthy woman, and that helped. Indeed, the Jewish Religious Union, if you look at the books, were very upper class. They had fine houses. And Matak was an intellectual. He was a fiery speaker, politically radical. He laid the foundation for social justice aspect of liberal Judaism. He gave a famous, well-publicized speech during the general strike supporting the miners. And the three M's became missionaries, especially Lily Montagu and Israel Matak. They wrote pamphlets by the dozen. They traveled the country. All three M's were wealthy, but I think Miss Lily was quite clear, and I think this is important to say. She would not use her father's vast fortune to support liberal Judaism in case it offended her father's sensibilities as the president of the Federation. Montefiore and Matak were more generous, and Montefiore's money allowed the production of a host of pamphlets and books explaining the tenets of liberal Judaism. But overall, I can detect from these backgrounds a reticence to openly talk about money, not making open appeals for money. They were not entrepreneurs. They were not business people. And it led to a modesty in synagogue buildings, in their architecture and so on. It needed, as I'll come on to, the arrival of Rabbi Sidney Brichto from America to change this. And I can point out that the liberal Judaism has always been more orientated to American reform, whereas the Reform Judaism, as well as its Sephardi heritage, increasingly has had German continental influences, as Jonathan mentioned. The three M's and their circle more Anglo than Jewish. Though of Orthodox backgrounds, their culture was English, upper class gentility. And I'm convinced this was a factor in the founding culture of liberal Judaism. It was a sort of Puritanism in a way, and therefore it wanted dignified services, good decorum, formal dress. Although these were true of the United Synagogue and the West London Synagogue at the time. It wanted a serious intellectual approach. Purim was abandoned because of its raucousness, also because of the revenge killing at the end of the Megillah. Simchat Torah with its dancing was not on. Bar mitzvah, because it was considered at 13-year-old, a boy was not committed enough to assume the mitzvah, and therefore confirmation at 15 or 16 was a better bet. There was no head covering for men, though hats were in for women. It may be an influence of the American reform that Mattock brought over. American reform even asked men to take their hats off in synagogue. After all, you did that when you entered a church. There was great choral singing with an organ, mostly in English. I recall services in my youth where perhaps 70 or 80% were in English. The services were radically shortened, an hour at most on a Shabbos morning, a short Torah reading, and we only read the acceptable bits. And yet there was a great spirituality. And Mattock particularly gave rousing sermons, often urging social justice. For a while, the main service was on Sunday mornings, and hundreds came to hear his addresses, including many Christians. As I say, the three M's became missionaries. Also had to do with social, and the same was true with West London Synagogue, a great tradition of the upper and middle classes working among the poor. Lily Monty goes 1893, she formed a girls' club. 1895, she wrote a prayer book to use in those Orthodox congregations on a Saturday afternoon. 1911, the High Holy Day service in Notting Hill. 1913, West End, she formed a synagogue. And the LGS supported Basil Henriques, who started a club in St. George's in the East. And it was set up in 1919 with the help of both the LGS and West London Synagogue. It shows the closeness of the two congregations in those days, family connections. The JRU started to look to form other congregations. In 1921, the Orthodox in Stamford Hill, or certain Orthodox people, wanted a reform. They spoke to West London Synagogue, but they didn't seem to be interested. In 1921, with liberal support, they opened a group, and Maurice Perlzweig, the son of an Orthodox minister, persuaded by the LGS to become the lay minister, and eventually he went to Cambridge, read rabbinics, and became a rabbi himself. And so it was set up in the more working class Stoke Newington. Interesting enough, because it often is been said, why do we have two groups? In 1926, the three M's they wanted to have a World Jewish Religious Union, and they founded what became the World Union for Progressive Judaism. There'd actually been an attempt before that, but the First World War came in, and since most of the people who were going to join were in Germany, it's a bit of a difficulty. But by 1926, they founded the World Union for Progressive Judaism. It's the centenary next year. Montefiore resisted talks about Zionism. Perlzweig had to fight. But Montefiore's view put a stamp on liberal attitudes until the Six-Day War, when it was known to be not particularly Zionist, sometimes very anti-Zionist. And then there was great growth, sort of the movement. 1929 in South London, 1922 had been in Westcliff, 1928 in Liverpool. Now, it's interesting as a reflection of what was going on then, because in Liverpool, the Prince's Road Synagogue had introduced a few prayers in English and had a mixed choir. And a number of places, like from my hometown in Birmingham, Singers Hill had a bimmer in the front. Although there was great opposition from the Orthodox, to both of these movements, and soon. And it was really all this pre-war time. There was a certain liberality in the United Synagogue. I remember that in Birmingham, that was founded in 1934, that they also had English prayers and a mixed choir. And it's also interesting. It was the members of this same Singers Hill synagogue who led the breakaway. And it was not because of social ease, because of conversion or anything like that. It was an intellectual belief that Montefiore and Mattock had persuaded people that this was the future of Judaism. In 1936, there was Brighton and so on and so forth. And as Jonathan mentioned, there was this attempt to bring together the two movements. Rabbi Reinhardt was probably closest, who was also from Hebrew Union College, closer to liberal, and Vivian Simmons, the second one, they preached at liberal synagogues. They worked on joint projects, Jewish education in public schools and so on. And as Jonathan said, it led to the attempts to merge, but it didn't happen. And then after then in the war, Southgate and Ealing were formed. They were actively working to expand the movement. 1946 in Dublin, although there was a great opposition. And what was the basis for the opposition? And it was that the liberals were anti-Zionist, and that also it led to conversion. Well, I think quite the opposite. We were allowed the conversion to take place. In 1954, there were 16 congregations within Liberal Judaism. I think it now is about 30. For me, in my lifetime, one of the two great leaders was Rabbi Sidney Brichto, born also somebody who had an Orthodox background, spoke Yiddish. He went to Hebrew Union College as well, and then came to London to do a PhD, and was approached by Rabbi Van der Zyl of West London and Leslie Edgar of Liberal Jewish Synagogue to become their rabbi, but Edgar won. And then in 1964, he became the executive director, and I think led to a huge growth of Liberal Judaism. There were even more new congregations. There was an evening institute, there was education, there were publications, and the whole movement became more mainstream and set about integrating into the general community. He became closer to the chief rabbi, the board of deputies, even the federation, and got the federation to approve a thing that if any of our members wanted to get, they would facilitate it, because they were more interested in avoiding aguna. And Sidney Brichto was a Zionist and had great battles. I remember for perhaps 2 decades particularly with Rabbi John Rayner, who I'll come on to in a minute, and the late Rabbi David Goldberg. And especially after the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur, Liberal Judaism became more mainstream, more Jewish, and more attached to Zionism. And then I said there were one congregation after another formed at this moment: Finchley, Crawley, Woodford, Bristol, my own synagogue, Northwood, Nottingham, and so on throughout the country. In truth, I have to say, Liberal Judaism is based on small communities, Reform Judaism on larger ones. If you went to a liberal synagogue in the 1950s, 60s, by and large, there were very few men wearing a kippah or a talit. As I said, the services were largely in English and so on. And as I said earlier, no bar mitzvahs, no parading scrolls, and no purim and all the rest of it. And also English versions of the hymns, "All the World Shall Come to Serve Thee," we sang with gusto. I mentioned Rabbi John Rayner, who became really the pillar of the intellectual future of Judaism, of Liberal Judaism, for many years. And he worked together, amongst other things, in revising the liturgy, something inspired by Sidney Brichto, but together with another American Reform rabbi, Chaim Stern, inspired a new approach with our new liturgy, the service of the heart, gate of repentance, with modern English. and so on. Siddur Lev Chadash and Machzor Chadai, they became inclusive, not only in modern English, non-gender specific, and so on. And I have to say, John Rayner, of all of them, was a pillar of liberal Judaism after the Second World War. As Jonathan mentioned, increasingly from the 1950s, liberal Judaism became more inclusive, patrilineal with mixed faith weddings. Although I have to say the founders were very much against mixed marriage because they saw it often happening in their own families. The acceptance of women rabbis and women in the synagogue and gays and so on, following the same passage, but without trying to score a point. I think in each of them, liberal Judaism led the way in those days. And then, as Jonathan said, there were various attempts to unite with the two movements. He mentioned the merger talks in 1984 to 5, and I was involved in those. And I have to say, except for a couple of really right-wing reform synagogues, it was largely the youth movements that couldn't get on. And I remember some vitriolic meetings in which terrible things were said about each other. But that's how it is. Sometimes the youth are the more radical, sometimes perhaps they're more embedded in where they are. And so on. I could talk about other attempts that have failed. We're now in a different era, and who knows what will be, what the history will record in another 50 years' time about the progress of progressive Judaism in this country and throughout Europe and the world, but we're only focused on this country. So a quick run through. Over to you, Simon, I think, unless, first of all, Jonathan wanted to correct me on a number of things because he's the better historian and wrote the first history book of Anglo Jewry, at least in our circle.
No mistakes, and let's invite people to have questions.
Cool. Fantastic. So if you have got a question, please raise your hand. I'll put it in the chat. We have had one question in, which is to Rabbi Jonathan, but both of you can answer because I think it affects both movements. You mentioned the Orthodox attacking the Reform movement, and they also attack the liberals. Can you give us examples of the sort of attacks that you mean?
Yes, and actually I said 1980s. It was probably from really the late 1960s really became more vociferous. You got rabbis, I remember, for instance, Rabbi Harris, I forget his first name, he then went on to South Africa, he was at Kenton, talked about reform being an escalator out of Judaism, or he accused Hugo Green of being a rabbi of vanilla Judaism. And there were regular ding-dongs in the Jewish Chronicle, the like of which, stopped eventually after the Stanmore, of course. But it was, and Orthodox rabbis would give sermons against reform. Yes, it was, and also spread untruths about reform. That, for instance, if your parents got married in a reform synagogue, if a couple got married in a reform synagogue, their children couldn't be Jewish. Well, that was not true. I mean, it was not. It was a lie, frankly, and time again, the chief rabbi was asked to correct them, and he did, because it just simply wasn't true. Because a child's status is dependent on its mother, according to the Orthodox anyway, and it's irrelevant where the parents got married. So even if they were married in a registry office without a religious ceremony, providing it was a Jewish mother, then the children would be just as Jewish in Orthodox eyes. So there was a lot of sniping, and it was actually to such an extent that it really began to put people off, particularly the younger generation, who just saw their elders behaving badly.
Yeah, I think it's true that I think the United Synagogue particularly changed after the Second World War with the arrival of a number of more right-wing or, more Orthodox rabbis from the continent, because it was reasonably acceptable before the war. And you also remember that in the JRU and in the West London, a number of the people who got involved in those the founding, at least in the JRU, were Orthodox reverends. And often would be open. And I remember when I was a student at Liberal College, there was a Jewish Preachers Association of liberal, and I was welcome there as a student, and there were liberal ministers at the time who sat alongside ministers, of course, reverends of the United Synagogue. So it was a much more tolerant era, and those things did change. And maybe they also changed because we became quite successful, and usually that was a reason to attack us. And I don't know, but yeah, it's and it depends on the rabbi. I mean, some rabbis even today can be so vitriolic against liberals, but others are quite tolerant. We were fortunate in Northwood to have a Rabbi Naphtali Brower, who was Northwood United Synagogue, and yet he'd come to our synagogue for Holocaust meetings and sit on the platform and address Rabbi Rachel Benjamin as rabbi. So there were some mensches, but some I won't name them. Could have been a little bitter and rather unfortunate for them, really.
Cool. No, thank you. And that question was from Janvier, and we've got another one that's been sent to me by Annette, which is the anti-Zionism of the past. What was the thinking behind that?
It was the West London Synagogue of British Jews. That was the foundation title, and that's how they saw themselves. And they were very worried that the rise of Israel and Zionism would lay them open to the accusation of dual loyalty. Are you really British, or have you got a loyalty elsewhere? So that was the great fear. And they worked very hard. They'd worked very hard for emancipation, for integration, and they didn't want to see that jeopardized by this new state in the.
Yeah, and Claude Montefiore was sort of very strong in his views. He was the president of the Anglo-Jewish Association, and he wrote a letter after the Balfour Declaration to the Times, saying that this was a retrograde step, and that continued for some time.
Cool. Okay, thank you. And I think we've got a question from Julian from Radlet Reform, who has his hand up.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Jonathan and Rabbi Andrew. Very, very informative and useful talk. I'm vice chair of Radlet Reform, and one of the problems that I've been having when I sort of talk to our community is trying to sort of understand the merger from a community viewpoint. It's very easy to look at the reform movement and the liberal movement as sort of an organizational merger where administration, everything, that's really easy sort of to go and say, yeah, this is a great merger. But actually, when we're talking about our communities and a liberal community and a reform community, it comes down to what are our actual communities and how do we talk to the communities themselves about what this merger brings to them, and what differences does it make? And I found your talk really, really valuable for that. I come from Temple, Israel. My background, I'm from Cape Town originally, so I grew up in Temple, Israel, which is that was the Reform Synagogue, sort of in Cape Town. And I knew nothing about liberal Judaism at all, being South African. So I had to go on my own journey recently to actually understand really what the differences were between liberal Judaism and Reform Judaism. And everything that I read today said, well, there are no differences, they're paper-thin differences. So I went through the same journey going backwards in time to discover that liberal Judaism was very much more radical than Reform Judaism, sort of at the beginning, and both have moved closer together.
Okay,
so,
let me give you a very strong reply.
Thank you.
Because the most important word you used was 3 letters, was. Yes, there were substantial, significant differences. They have virtually all disappeared. If you came from Mars, I don't think you look at all Martian, but so nothing personal, and landed in England, and you went to a Reform or Liberal synagogue, you would find it almost impossible to know which is which, because some Reform synagogues are very liberal, small l, in the way they conduct their services. Others, and whether it was English and Hebrew balance, or the use of an organ or not an organ, and the goodness knows what. And the other important thing is that the merger really is going to be at HQ level. It's not going to affect the congregations, and it can't affect congregations because we're all autonomous. If Maidenhead, for instance, which I used to be rabbi of, wanted to change their services to a Sunday afternoon because it was more convenient, then we would do so. And the MRJ, the Reform Movement, couldn't do a thing about it. So each congregation will still do its own thing. But then the differences are just really to do with the character of the synagogue, the personality of the rabbi, and they change enormously. I can cite congregations, I won't do so because the rabbis are still living, where there's been a change of rabbi and a complete change in the way the congregation runs itself. And there's nothing, frankly, that cannot be sorted out in this merger without those two essential religious ingredients of goodwill and common sense. And I'll tell you one other thing, and I hope this doesn't sound too strong. We have a moral duty to get on with it. We have no right to talk about peace in the Middle East and Arabs and Israelis living side by side if we can't, in England, two progressive reform movements, get our own act together. What hope for the rest of the world? This is a good opportunity for us to show that harmony and compromise are religious mitzvot.
Yeah, and if I can, on a different theme, I've also been to Temple Israel in Cape Town, and I can tell you the services, 30 years ago that I went, the services were identical to my liberal service here, and that the South African movement used basically the American Reform prayer book, and the American Reform prayer book was more radical than our liberal prayer book. So had you come, instead of going to Radlett, had you come to our synagogue, you'd have felt very much at home, because we got loads of South Africans, and I see you're so hark back to South Africa. You've got a reminder of South Africa in your background there.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian. I can see Peter Brill has his hand up, so I'll bring him in because I know that his question is similar to the one we just heard.
Rabbi Romain, you've sort of talked about the fact that there are virtually no differences, and you've highlighted some of those. But the thing that you've highlighted is that those differences are individual views of rabbis and individual communities. It's been made very clear that the movement overall is not going to interfere with the way that individual communities are run. I know that there are concerns amongst some of the communities that I've talked to around certain issues. LGBTQ and transgender issues is one very particular one, and the other one is the matrilineal patrilineal, where the movement is saying, yep, it's absolutely, equilineal. But we have had examples where members have gone to other communities. They've moved from where we are, gone to other communities that may be a reform or vice versa, liberal community, and been told, I'm sorry, but we're not going to accept you. Now, if you have a situation where the movement is saying it's equilineal, if you have a situation where the movement is saying we strongly believe in supporting issues around transgender, but individual communities are saying, I'm sorry, but we don't work that way, how are you going to square that circle?
Well, that circle or that problem already exists because there is a diversity within the reform movement. So by and large, I would say like 90 or 85% of reform congregations will accept LGBTQ and trans as just simply not being an issue. There are one or two congregations that don't. So it exists within us already, and we just have to live with people having a right to have a slightly different view. Similarly, but that frankly tends to reflect the personality of the rabbi. And I've seen rabbis leave and congregations literally do a somersault in their attitude. An obvious example was a major congregation was against the equilineal line. Rabbi left, congregation now accepts it. So, sometimes you just have to give people time and patience to come round to it. And there is no doubt on all of those issues that we're inching towards harmony.
Thank you. Before we go to David, who's got his hand up, a question again on this sort of differences, because part of where we pitched this was what's the difference that we've had in, is what do you think, and it may have been the two things you just talked about, what do you think were the last remaining differences between the movements that disappeared to allow us to do this?
I'm hesitating because it's just been so obvious for quite a while that there aren't any. And by the way, I should tell you, if people weren't aware, that the initiative for this latest merger was from the rabbis themselves. There was a meeting where we got together about 2 or 3 years ago, and we were discussing something completely different. And we just sort of somebody said, well, we should tackle this together, and why aren't we doing this together? And everyone else nodded, and that was really one of the kickstarts to it. I suppose the last thing to answer your question was the patrilineal, equilineal, matrilineal issue, which we sorted out our end about 3 or 4 years ago now. It's very hard, as I think Andrew said, the differences are now just in style. It's nothing substantial.
I think what one has to be honest that I mean, and I've said this before, and I think it comes down to what I was saying earlier. I think there is deep down a cultural difference between the movements, and that's certainly been something that those people who are moving the integration of the two movements. Liberals largely felt that there was a less businesslike. I mentioned the fact that our founders were not entrepreneurs; they were just rich people, and therefore money wasn't a thing. And I think liberals have always felt that the reform movement, we're not talking about the rabbis or the congregation, were more hard-nosed in terms of the organization of the movement. And I think there's been an undercurrent of the fact that by and large, the rabbis tended to have more of a say in the movement, in the liberal movement, than whereas it was more the lay people in the reform movement. Now, that may or may not be right, but that is certainly a feeling that has been around.
Oh, can I come in there? Because you see, that's a good example of misperception.
Yeah.
Not of you, but of the feeling, because it was always the rabbis that have led the major changes within reform. It was us who introduced mixed faith blessings, us who changed the rules about trans, us who changed the prayer book to inclusive language. Really, a lot of the initiatives have come from the rabbis, and it's actually a misperception, an old rabbi's tale, that we are lay-led as opposed to.
Well, I don't think it was rabbis; it was the lay people that felt that there was a different cultural difference.
Yeah. Well, lay people can be wrong. I know.
All right, it all depends.
Just between you and me, Andrew. Okay.
Okay, so at that point, I'm going to bring in David, who's had his hand up for a little while.
Thank you. And I loved, this is just a comment, I did love Jonathan's comment about there being one or two difficult rabbis. Only one or two, Jonathan. I'm sure that's an understatement. I'm a member of the Liberal group, as you know, a member of the Liberal group in Bristol, but I come to reform services in Cornwall and elsewhere. And I've said the same thing, that if you came from outside, you wouldn't be able to put a wafer between the liturgies. Rather interesting, occasionally bits come up that are different, and that's always interesting. What I wanted to say, and it's never struck me before, is in the talks you've both given, there's a sense of a bit of tension between the two movements over the years. Nothing very strong, but the tension has kind of fueled the approach and the movements and the way in which people have developed. And I just wonder, and I'd be very interested to hear, whether there's a risk that if we all get together, we lose the tension and we stop moving, we become a bit stable and fixed in our ways.
No, I would disagree with that. Not that there's been a tension, but that it will lose our momentum, because we've never seen each other as rivals. What can we do that the liberals can't, or how can I get one over my liberal rabbis? I think we've really developed, whether it was intermarriage or gay or whatever, in response to society. And again, just think of some of the rabbis that we've got from the liberals or vice versa. And like Mark Goldsmith, of course, who was a important rabbi in the LJ and now is a leading rabbi with Edgware and was Aleph beforehand. Those people like Julia Neubauer, like Alex Wright, those people couldn't exist and swap movements unless they felt at home in both.
Yeah,
values were shared.
I have to own up. I mean, Mark Goldsmith is one of my failures. I mean, I baby blessed him and I bar-mitzvahed him, and then he became a turncoat and joined the Reform. I think, but just to be honest, I think there's one thing that in a way I don't say I fear, but one thing that I think has been a strength of the two movements in the past, because I've always felt that one of them would make a move and we egged on the other. One of them, we inspired the others. Certainly so, it struck me in liturgy. It was, we came out with a prayer book and the Reform came out with a prayer book, and each time learnt from the others. I think to some extent, we have not egged each other up, that's the wrong word. We have inspired the other ones, and a bit of tension sometimes is a bonus. It's when it becomes vicious that there is a problem, or it becomes destructive rather, then there is a problem. But it is there. But on the other hand, I do know that within both movements, there are some synagogues who inspire the others, that some synagogues make movement. And I can think of some of the movements made during COVID. Some synagogues reacted, made brave moves, and that did give the other synagogues, oh, well, maybe we should do that. And I think that within synagogues, we will be a movement, and there will be different attitudes and different strengths. And hopefully, getting on together, you can sometimes inspire the others by the actions you take.
Thank you very much, David. We're coming to the end now, so I'd just like to ask Rabbi Andrew and Rabbi Jonathan just to give us a sort of 1 or 2 sentence summary, just to sum up what you said tonight and your hopes for the future. So we'll start with Rabbi Andrew.
Very good of you. I don't know. I mean, the movement is no doubt is going to go ahead. We will forge ahead. Certainly, we will. Maybe a lot of the discussions between the two movements will continue until there is one movement. But in the future, I just hope that the different synagogues and the strengths that both movements bring to each other will be for the benefit of Anglo Jewry. And will be a new unified movement that will be seen as a force of strength. And hopefully we'll be tackling the things that I saw the setting up of the Jewish Religious Union was, to actually inspire people to come to shul, to be more Jewish, to study more. And it will be a serious movement that's real aim is to revive the Jewish community.
Yeah, I'd echo that, and just remind everybody, of course, that the merger really is at central level, HQ level, and that each synagogue will remain just as independent as before and be able to do its own thing as before. Let me let you into a little secret. Reform and Liberal rabbis over the last year have regularly met together, both the assembly and the conference. And what's been really interesting is how things have divided. Discussions have divided, or meal times have divided. It's never between liberal rabbis in one corner and reform rabbis in the other. It's always been left-leaning liberal and reform rabbis in one corner and right-leaning reform and liberal rabbis in the other. So that diversity is going to continue. And I will end with 3 words: bring it on.